Well, all right, everybody, it is 11:03, so I am going to officially start this program. Hello, I'm Britt Campbell, the Manager of Public Engagement at the Autry Museum. At the Autry, we always like to acknowledge the ancestral caretakers of the Autry where it sits, who are the Tongva. They have continued to be stewards of the land and will continue in the future. I do also want to frame this conversation. Route 66 runs through 29 tribal lands and 44 sundown towns. So we really will be filling out the icon of the Mother Road. Well, enough from me. I'm going to throw it to Katrina, who's going to introduce our esteemed panel and kick off the program.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Can we go to my first slide? All right. Thank you all so much for being here. The wonderful thing about doing a virtual event like this, which is, you know, very much thanks to Brittany's hard work, the Autry Museum and the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is making this event possible, and one of the films, is that I know we have people from all over. We have people internationally who are logging into this, people from all over the US, as well as people who are living in Route 66 communities like Monrovia and Winslow, Arizona. So I want to welcome you all. And because I think there's probably a breadth of knowledge about Route 66 here, I just wanted to give a brief introduction. So those of you who aren't as familiar with it will have some basic ideas to work from. Next slide, please. Route 66 goes through 8 states. When it got its start in 1926, it really became this very important economic, cultural transportation corridor. It starts in Chicago, goes to the coast, to California, and it's, as I think I said, 2,600 miles. And I first became aware of Route 66 doing the Harvey Girls documentary. Next slide. As I interviewed some of the later Harvey Girls, like Mary Mochimaru Montoya in Gallup, New Mexico, I realized that after the railroads went into decline, these women who had been railroad waitresses forged interesting careers for themselves on Route 66. And so that piqued my interest, and I wondered, were there ways that women's lives were impacted beyond the waitresses and women working in mom and pop businesses that I might not be aware of? And I was pleasantly surprised. Next slide. And the first phase of the project was building this website, thanks to the grant from the National Park Service. So it has over 75 women's stories on the site, and that you can sort them by geography, by location. We have politicians, archaeologists, anthropologists, creative women, but it really did have a major impact. And not only were these women's lives shaped, but they also helped to shape the road. Next slide. In the 1920s, there are sort of certain themes in terms of decade, in terms of women's experience that I think come to the forefront. In the 1920s, women embraced the automobile. They wanted to control their destiny. And so there are actually a lot of pictures of women driving more than you might think, and doing things like changing tires and changing the oil, changing the water. They wanted to show that they too could do it. Next slide. In the 1930s, Route 66 becomes a road of exodus. People fleeing the Dust Bowl in Texas and Oklahoma take the road to California, and you have someone like photographer Dorothea Lange out on the road capturing their experience with her amazing photographs, some of which we'll see in Candacy's film, which is coming up shortly. In the 1940s, it becomes a major military corridor, and you have women like the women at the Navajo Ordnance Depot right outside of Flagstaff, They're pictured in the top slide, and they're adjusting the fin lock nut on bombs. And then in the 1950s, when men come back from the war, it becomes the road that we associate with kind of the American family vacation. And it's in the 1950s that it, I think, first goes into pop culture with Bobby Troupe's song, Get Your Kicks on Route 66, that he made with Nat King Cole. Of course, his wife, Cindy Troupe, she's actually the one who came up with the name for the song, and always felt like she should get a songwriting credit, but she didn't. And it was in the 50s that women were, you know, they lost many of the jobs they had enjoyed in the 40s, and because men were coming home from the war, and it was assumed they would go back to being homemakers. Next slide. And in the 60s with On the Road, Easy Rider, the Route 66 TV show, this is when the road becomes popular not only in America, but it's introduced to international travelers. And this kind of concept of the road signifying adventure, freedom, it really catches on, and it's something that is latched onto by an international audience. But I think what's important to know, and what, you know, we are exploring in these films, is that this is not the reality for many people on Route 66. You know, the reality is, next slide, please. In California, it's kind of a particularly interesting place to look at this because it's the ultimate destination on Route 66. When it enters the Union in 1850, it's the Free State, it's the Golden State, and it's seen as this kind of land of opportunity, and that's in fact how it's marketed. But the reality is it's not that way for everyone, and when people come here, and the people who were already living here face segregation, racism, and prejudice. And so we've selected these films today because we think they're, you know, particularly relevant to the time period today. But we also, I think these stories are also inspiring, and you know, they show that institutions and people do, you know, sometimes make the right decisions. So we hope that you enjoy them and that you'll take part in the conversation after. Next slide. These films would not be possible without support from all of these organizations. And Cinefem has been my longtime fiscal sponsor, and the National Park Service, Route 66 Corridor Preservation Program, and all the state humanities councils have been a great help in this project. And of course, there's also people who have made this project what it is, and it really wouldn't be possible without historian advisors, some of whom are part of this panel and some of whom are not, but women who I met at the Autry, like through the Autry, like Dr. Virginia Scharf and Dr. Heidi Osler in Arizona. They kind of first introduced me to how to frame my work in a women's history context. Next slide. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists. Marva Felchlin retired in 2018 as the Director of Libraries and Archives at the Autry Museum, where she facilitated staff and researcher access to one of the nation's most comprehensive collections of books, archives, and audio materials and artifacts on Native American history and culture and the history of the American West. And I can really attest to the wonders of working with Marva, and she's the one who really pointed me to both the work of Dr. Virginia Scharf and also Native American perspectives on Route 66. Dr. Suzy Ling has taught history for over 30 plus years on Route 66 at Pasadena Community College. She's also collected oral histories of residents in Monrovia and the San Gabriel Valley. She's a member of the Monrovia Historical Museum, Monrovia Historic Preservation Group, and the Chinese Historical Society of California. And it was really her articles in the Monrovia Weekly that caught my attention and led me to connect with both Keiko Sakatani and Councilman Larry Spicer. Keiko Sakatani is a third-generation Monrovia resident. Her grandfather, Yutaru Uyeda, became Monrovia's Strawberry King. He worked on the Pacific Electric Red Line and settled in Monrovia. And the family had a storefront on Route 66, otherwise known as Huntington Drive. And Councilman Larry Spicer is a Monrovia native who is very proud of his service in the U.S. Army. And his service in Monrovia continues. He's involved in Peace on Patrol, Watchdog Dad for public schools. He was city planning commissioner and is currently a city council member, a position he was appointed to in 2012 and then elected 7 years ago. He's a member of Monrovia's Make a Difference Day, and he's been recognized by the state of California 41st Assembly District Veteran of the Year in 2017. And Candacy Taylor is an award-winning author, photographer, and cultural documentarian working on a transdisciplinary project based on the Green Book. She's the author of the best-selling book, Overground Railroad, The Green Book and the Roots of Black Travel in America. This book was just recently nominated for Oprah's list of top travel books, and it has received many accolades. She's the curator of and content specialist for an exhibition that will be toured by the Smithsonian in 2020, and it will travel throughout the US for 3 years. And Taylor was a fellow at the Hutchins Center at Harvard University under the direction of Henry Louis Gates Jr. So thank you, panelists, all of you for being here. And I think we can go to the first film now.
My name is Candacy Taylor. I'm a cultural documentarian and an author. I'm working on a project based on the Negro Motorist Green Book. The South was notorious for its Jim Crow laws and being so racist and dangerous. There were about 4 lynchings happening every week. But the truth is, even as Black people left the South, they saw very quickly that racial discrimination was just as bad and things were just as violent, and the ramifications of racism were just as deadly throughout the country. You know, Route 66 mirrored the circumstances of its time. You know, in the 30s, it was a migratory path for people who were fleeing the Dust Bowl. It was a migratory path for people who had lost everything in the Depression in Chicago and decided they were going to go west because things were better there. So there were a lot of struggling, poor white people who were taking the road as well. But the Black experience was obviously even more challenging, especially for the middle class Black drivers who had nicer cars, because they would get pulled over and harassed by police officers. They wouldn't believe that it was their car. So they would drive with a chauffeur's hat and a chauffeur's coat in the back. So if they got pulled over, that was the story that they would tell the police officers, that, you know, this isn't my car, this is my employer's car. And you'd ask, well, where's your hat? And they'd have the chauffeur's hat there. Those were the things that they had to do to travel safely across the country. 44 out of the 89 counties along Route 66 were sundown towns. And sundown towns were all white communities. They were all white on purpose. Even, you know, so some towns had signs posted saying, "Nigger, don't let the sun go down on you here." There were alarms that sounded at 6 o'clock at night warning Black people that they needed to leave. So given that half the counties along Route 66 were sundown towns, you really needed a guide. The Negro Motorist Green Book was created by Victor H. Green, and he was a postal worker from Harlem. And he was a Black man, and he saw that even in the 1930s, even though he was in New York, there was incredible racial discrimination and segregation. The Negro Motorist Green Book started in 1936, and it was like a AAA for Black people, but it was even much more than that, because there were tailors and nightclubs and drugstores and liquor stores and even doctors were in there. There were gas stations. There were still, at that time, many gas stations that wouldn't serve black people. If you were stranded, your car broke down, you needed somebody to tow you, there were resources in this book. It really allowed people to hit the open road and see the rest of America. Here we are at the original west end of the Mother Road. This is Clifton's, which was a Green Book property, which is very exciting. There are 220 Green Book properties in Los Angeles, 23 of them downtown, and only out of those 23, 6 are still standing. A lot of Green Book businesses were owned by blacks, but then there were some that weren't, and this is one of them. Clifford Clinton was a white man who owned this property. Clifton's was established in 1932, and that was right in the Depression era restaurant. It was one of the classic places to come, not only because it was right in the middle of downtown, it was right at the very end of Route 66. It was also a place where you could dine free and less delighted, that was the term. They had a 5-cent meal, or you could pay what you felt like the food was worth. So you had the option of not paying, which was very unique, but in the spirit of the times and in the spirit of Clifford Clinton, who owned Clifton's. He thought of this in the Depression when there was still, so much fear and scarcity, but he saw that there was still too much here for people to not have a warm meal and not have the basics. And he created a business model that made it possible for him to give away free food and then have this vibrant business. And because he had opened up his doors to people who were struggling financially in the city, so of course it attracted so many different kinds of people. So it was always integrated. Clifton's always had this kind of fantastic, magical wonderland feeling to it. It still has that essence of what it felt like to be here. There are 3 active floors. There's all these like nooks and crannies you could go and explore things. There's nothing like it. And for it to still be in operation is a miracle. And to have this Green Book history associated with it, it's just it's very special.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that clip. It was so informative. And now I just wanted to take a moment to post a resource in the chat because it has to do with the question I'm going to ask Candacy. So in 2017, in a NEH Q&A interview, in response to the question, why do you think it's important to reach a wide readership with your work? You responded with this answer, and I just thought how poignant a time to kind of reflect back on this, given the systematic racism that has been brought to light most recently in police brutality. But it just seems like are we further ahead? What's going to emerge as the Green Book for now, or what can the past teach us about how to combat racism in America?
Here I am. You can hear me, right?
Yep.
Okay. Yes, I think this was critical in terms of even when I was doing this research for this project. I had spent time at the Schomburg doing scholarly research. I had been at Harvard doing the scholarly research, and then I left and went on the road. And I was on the road for several years, really. I put my things in storage. I was living in LA at the time. I live in Harlem now. But it came very clear to me when I started scouting these Green Book sites throughout the country, because they're traditionally in Black neighborhoods. Like Harlem and also Bronzeville in Chicago, the south side of Chicago. And even though I had traveled a lot for my other books and my other projects, I had never seen the level of poverty and disparities that I had seen when I was doing this research. And so at the end of all that travel, by the time I got back to sit down to write the book, I basically rewrote my proposal. And I said, this is not a guide that should be written as this historic time capsule. Because all of these policies that we've had throughout since, while the Green Book was in publication and since, including like urban renewal, gentrification, redlining, mass incarceration, those are social forces that were largely government-led that created these disparities. It was not about that there were just some racists or some KKK members that decided they didn't like Black people and that's why we have racism. The most hurtful and long-lasting and enduring racism that Black people suffer today, it's largely because of government policies. And so my book, I felt like, had to really mirror that history and retell that story, because you can see it repeating itself over and over again. We look at redlining and we think, oh, that was, started in the 30s and 40s. I mean, and when you look at when Black soldiers came back from the war and the New Deal was supposed to offer all these opportunities for all Americans, and it didn't work out that way because Black people were routinely and largely just shut out of those opportunities. So redlining was one of those things that really made sure that even if you could get a loan as a Black person, which was very difficult, although they were freely given out to white Americans, your value was not, your property wasn't worth the same as as white people. And so that intergenerational wealth that happened from that era, can be calculated in terms of why there's such an economic disparity. And when you look at gentrification today, you can see how urban renewal decimated Black communities in the 60s, but today it's gentrification, and they called it progress then, and they're calling it progress now. So it was really clear to me that that's really how this material had to be approached and how we can understand and learn from this history. So it was an honor to basically write that kind of book, and my publisher allowed me to, when I got back, I said, I'm going to rewrite the proposal. If you don't like the original, if you don't like this, we can go back to the original, project that I sold. And Abrams was really bold and innovative and an ally in me being able to tell this story. So it's been quite an honor. And I'm happy to be here today. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you. I think in a review that I had read, it makes clear that the American dream isn't for everybody. And I think that is just happening. We're living in history now. And so it's so great to have your work as a resource or a reinterpretation or collective creative reimagining. Thank you, Candacy. I'm sure we'll hear from her later. Now we're going to move on to a clip that features Councilman Larry Spicer.
The Spicer family arrived in Monrovia in 1947. My dad was born in Farrows, Mississippi, and my mom was born in Shedd, Mississippi. So they're pretty close by. And my dad worked at a little market, and my mom would come in there, and my dad told me this years later, that he was saying to himself that he's gonna marry that pretty woman. And so he ended up marrying her, and that's when they ended up migrating to California after a couple of years. Well, my dad used to talk to me about him working in the cotton fields because he had to make money to help support the family because the family was so large. And my grandfather had taken off and migrated down to Florida to pick fruit, so he would send money back. They were just taught to survive, live off the scraps, and they figured one day, the Lord would bless them to have a better life. My dad noticed a lot of African Americans, being killed and things like that. And so my dad came here on Route 66, my dad was able to send for my mom. This picture is of my dad and mom at the 5-4 Club. This is a Friday night, and my grandmother's babysitting us, and my dad and mom is having a great time after a hard week of working. Once my parents moved here, they joined Second Baptist Church because they were right down the street on Maple. So now this here, when I first started here at Second Baptist, this wasn't out front. This walk-up wasn't out front. It was just the steps going up to the door. At that time, Second Baptist Church was the largest African-American church around, you know, in this area, in the San Gabriel Valley. From Walnut Street to the railroad tracks on the north and south side, and from Myrtle to Mountain was African Americans. And that general grid square, that's where all the African Americans were located in Monrovia.
This is your elementary school.
Yes, this is my elementary school. 5th grade classroom, 4th grade. My 3rd grade classroom was on the west side of the school. And kindergarten, that's where it is. And that's where I started the Boy Scouts. The first black Cub Scouts was right here with Forrest Hooks. My mom was a businesswoman, and her name was Geneva, but everyone called her Gigi. And she was a domestic worker. Here in Monrovia, she was the lady who entertained dignitaries and just all the prominent black people, you know. She would throw this nice party and stuff, you know. We would be in the back room. She would never have a babysitter for us because she felt like we were her kids, so she didn't want someone else having to take care of us. We started going back to Mississippi in 1965. I was 10 years old then, and I remember that vividly. We were always on the 2-lane highway, which was, you know, Route 66. And in those days, we were kind of bunched in there, you know. And I remember my dad, he wouldn't stop and sleep. He would just drive all the way there. And it was a long ways, right? And he'd just smoking his cigar. He always had the window open because he didn't want us to be inhaling all the smoke, even though we did get a little piece of it. And I remember the cigar was an Edward cigar. It smelled so good. Traveling on Route 66, prior to us leaving, they would put this burlap sack bag in the front because back in those days, you know, the cars weren't as good as they are now. So you needed to carry some water, and they would hook it on the front of the car. So if the car ran hot, you had your water, you know, and stuff. And so we would ask my dad about that all the time. You know, we were very curious about the things that he was doing. And he would call my mom, her name was Geneva. Geneva, come get these kids. I'm trying to load up the car and stuff, you know. We were excited. My mom prepped all the food, you know, the clothing. She took care of everything. My mom would drive, but my mom, man, she had a heavy foot. She drove too fast. My dad didn't like that. My mom would get on down the road, so he would drive the most. We always traveled with another family, the Barnes. So it was 2 families driving behind one another on Route 66 the whole time. On convoying, we would get to these gas stations. My dad would take my sisters, you know, because he didn't want them going out in the bushes like us. And he would go and stand out there, you know, him and my mom. But he made sure that he would gas up the car, and then he would park the car over by the bathroom so he could see us. You know, he didn't want to leave us alone. But a couple of times, you know, the people were really, you know, the tenant, you know, they were using the N-word just over and over. Never served, you know, using, you know, proper language. But it was in this and that. And my dad was just polite, keep his head up, got in the car, and then he would talk to us while he's driving, you know, about how bad people can be, but you have to overlook it because there's better people in the world.
At this time, I'd like to invite back to the stage Councilman Larry Spicer.
I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Did you hit video?
Nope.
Okay. I think if you,
There you
there we are.
go.
Well, just kind of reflecting on where we started with Candace's share out and moving into your clip, it seems like your family definitely had a strategy for Route 66. Driving with another family, perhaps where y'all parked the car when the girls were going to the restroom. Do you think that was intentional to kind of have a safe space with another traveling group? Or as a kid, did it just seem normal? What was your experience as a kid kind of combating those things?
So remember, I was 10 years old, and I thank you guys for all of this, because it brought back a lot of memories, and that's how I was able to remember this. But anyway, the Barnes lived right next door to us at 428 East Los Angeles. We were at 432. And being great neighbors, and by the Barnes family coming up out of Mississippi too, they lived down in Prentice. So that's how we would, whenever, during the summer, they would always plan ahead about the families getting together and taking the long drive. And yes, it was like a security blanket, so to speak, because the Barnes family, it was a family of 5, and we were a family of 7, plus additional cousins and things like that along with us. But yes, it was pretty much like a security blanket because we all looked out for one another. And
at that time, I thought it was interesting. Candacy had said in her own family and friends, 95% of people actually hadn't heard of the Green Book. Was that something that when you were traveling, you knew as a resource, or it just wasn't around?
No, I think Candace, for enlightening me, because I never knew about I didn't know anything about the Green Book. I remember there was a Green Book stamps. That was the only thing I remember, that they had back in the day, but not in regards to the things that Candace was telling me about. She just enlightened me with a whole bunch of history I didn't know anything about.
And I also was wondering, and I don't know if it's true, I read in the Pasadena Independent that after spending some time in the military, you crisscrossed the state 8 times. If that is true, did you ever drive along Route 66 again, or did your travels take you elsewhere?
To be honest with you, my family, we have driven across parts of Route 66, but like nowadays, the highway interconnect, the freeways interconnect with Route 66.
Right.
But yes, we did. We drove from Monrovia to South Carolina, from South Carolina back up to Washington, D.C. So yes, road trip from the old days, right?
From the old days. Well, Larry, again, Councilman, thank you so much for sharing. Again, I'm sure we'll hear more from you later. Now we're going to move into a clip about Keiko that also features Susie, as did Larry's clip. So.
Women were not only mobile within the U.S., they were crossing international borders in unprecedented numbers in order to seize opportunities along Route 66, the Mother Road.
My grandmother came here around 1917 from Japan. I understand it was a dispute with her parents, and she decided to become a picture bride, exchange pictures, and she found a match with my grandfather. She was very independent. She was really a character.
So here are the Yutaro and Naka,
That's right.
Ueda, in the Western clothing, huh? Isn't that
Right,
sweet?
yes.
So they got married in 1918.
My grandfather came here first at the turn of the century, early 1900s, via Hawaii from Japan. He worked on the railroads there and some field work, and then he had the opportunity to come here to California, Los Angeles, to work on the railroad tracks. And so when the railroad tracks stopped in Monrovia, that's where he settled, and he loved it here. But Monrovia, as for a Japanese man or Japanese family, there weren't any jobs available. And from what I understand, there were jobs, but not for Japanese. They were not American citizens, and so they could not own property. So my grandfather bought property in the name of my uncle. Because he was born here, he was an American citizen. He went into farming, and he became very prosperous here and well-known, farming the fields behind the property, and also looking for empty properties for him to garden and grow his crops. My grandmother and my mother and aunt sold the fruits and primarily strawberries. My grandmother did not work the crops. From the beginning, she took care of the money. She didn't like it here, was planning to go back to Japan. So my grandfather didn't know about her sending money back there for her future needs. So I think it was about 5 cents or a few pennies for a whole flat of strawberries. So my grandfather in marketing, what he would do, it was the main route to Palm Springs at that time. And so there was business from probably stars and people, affluent people going to Palm Springs. And what he'd do, he'd put the flats of strawberries along Route 66. And so they would pick it up, bring it to the store, pay for it, and be off.
It says in the back, first car. The family now had a car.
Yes. That car.
Now this photograph of Isamu says 1928. I think this was the one that was prepared for his service or funeral.
Oh, my mother would have been 5 at that time, and so he was about 4 years older, so yes. My uncle, Isamu, was 9 when he was killed after he was kicked by one of the big horses. They were playing on it. He was at the Children's Hospital because he survived, I guess, for several months after. My grandmother visited him in the hospital almost daily. I never saw her drive ever in my life, but evidently at that time she did drive the car into Los Angeles down Route 66 to visit him. I don't think she would have had a driver's license. It was just a tragic accident, and the firstborn son for both of them. My mother was born on Route 66. My mother is second one from
Second girl from the left. It's an incredible picture that was captured of the Japanese American community in Monrovia.
My mother lived on Huntington Drive. Monroe's school was only about 3 blocks away. This is where I went to elementary school, right in Monrovia. And when she was growing up from Huntington, she was not able to attend Monroe.
Southern California couched itself in this language that we were the free state since 1850, we were the golden state. So it was very unclear a lot of times whether there were legal racial restrictions or just social racial restrictions.
They couldn't cross one street that was just 3 blocks from them. It was around 1942 that the FBI, via the Monrovia Police Department, knocked on the door one evening and took my grandfather to be interrogated to the camp in New Mexico in Santa Fe, where he was interrogated there. They took mostly the leaders of the Japanese community or businessmen. there were posters that were plastered on telephone poles that if you are Japanese that live from this street to this area, you will report to Santa Anita with just what you could carry by hand, your suitcase, one suitcase, that's it.
Santa Anita Racetrack, for example, suddenly became a community of about 17,000 persons. The Army provided housing and plenty of healthful, nourishing food for all.
My cousin Bacon was there in Santa Anita, and he remembers the horse stalls that some of them had to be housed in before the barracks came, and the smell was just horrible. When my mother and my grandmother went past Santa Anita, and they noticed the barbed wire, the guards facing in, and all of these Japanese. For my mother and my grandmother, when they went to the Pomona Fairgrounds waiting to be processed, my mother remembers how humiliating it was. At that time, she was about 18, 19, had just started at Pasadena City College, and my mother, they had a ceremony goodbye to the Japanese. My grandfather had a gas pump on the property, and Mr. Good was a representative for Standard Oil, but he was just a lovely man. And my grandfather and Mr. Good just really hit it off and became very good friends, and the story is they became probably very good drinking buddies. When the executive order 9066 that Roosevelt had issued because of the Japanese being a threat, he most likely contacted Mr. Good and gave him power of attorney. Mr. Good rented out the property, and during the time that my mother and my grandparents were in the concentration camps, he sent them the monthly checks. But many families lost everything.
Well, now I'd like to welcome to the virtual screen, Susie and Keiko. So Susie, you're kind of the first one, at least in the context of the film clips, to bring up the difference between legal racial restrictions and social racial restrictions. And I just wonder, as a historian and still a Monrovia resident, do you think there are still social racial restrictions in place, or have we had progress?
That's a really tough question. Of course, we've had some progress, but someone as impatient as me wish that we had moved a lot further in this last 400 years. Monrovia is trying. We've had some Black Lives Matter rallies at our library park. We also had a Juneteenth celebration gosh, was that last week? It seems so long ago. And we're trying, but I think this whole Black Lives Matter situation has really caused each and every one of us to question ourselves. How racist am I? How sexist am I? How homophobic am I? You know, I was thinking recently about the Edmund Petrus Bridge. I know this is a little far-fetched, but at the Selma, you know, that Dr. King and the Selma marchers marched through. By the way, there was a Monrovian, Asian American Monrovian that marched with them at Selma by the name of Kiyoshi Kuramiya. Edmund Petrus, the bridge, is named after a KKK, I don't know what they're called, Grand Stars, or
We don't even need to name it. We don't need to know.
and he was a Confederate general. And the bridge was named for him as late as 1907, way after the Civil War. This was a way for the South to kind of sort of, I don't know, stick it to you, all right? And so something like that, something like the Junipero Serra statues that we have in our community, I'm real torn about this. Junipero Serra was definitely one of the major founders of Los Angeles and all the surrounding communities. On the other hand, he did cause the death of many indigenous people. So we're all taking another look at our own systemic, our own biases, our own prejudice, the way that our history was not written correctly, the way that Asian American history is sort of ignored in this, in the American history books. And so, you know, hooray to Katrina Parks for even bringing up the Asian American history. We traveled Route 66 more from from west to east. And so we went the other way.
The other way. That's such great insights shared. And I think that's kind of why I'm so excited about this panel, given the current times, is that it is Route 66 can really be this case study for how to reevaluate American history, and really the idea that we're telling a mostly maybe white male narrative in what we think of and what information gets disseminated. Keiko kind of changing to, I think as inspirational maybe as we get to be today, given the topics we're discussing. Your family seemed to have a advantage because of your relationship with Mr. Good. I'm gonna unmute you because I don't know. I just wonder, if you wanted to expand on that perhaps, or did you ever meet him? Did he stay? Hold on, let me get your mute. Keiko, can you try unmuting yourself? I don't know why. Perfect.
Okay. Oh, so Mr. Good, I did have an opportunity to meet him. He was quite elderly, and he suffered from Alzheimer's, and I met his wife also. So one of the favorite things that I remember about them, he was just very jovial, very nice. And when I did meet him, he called me Toshko. That's my aunt.
Oh.
So I remembered her name. And Mrs. Good, at Christmas time, she would always make us orange bread and date nut bread. And the aroma was just wonderful, and we looked forward to that. And what my dad did, since he worked at a produce store, he would have a nice box of fresh fruits and vegetables for her. So one of the things that was quite amazing too, my mother passed away, she was 94, and just, I think a year prior to that, or several months, a year prior to that, we were driving around the neighborhood because Susie had found out the exact address where Mr. Good lived. And so I drove her past that, and she knew exactly whose house it was when she saw it. And I thought that was quite remarkable because they were important in our lives. He even picked several Japanese families up at the railroad station and took them all out to dinner when they came back from the concentration camps. So he was a wonderful friend. And as I said in the clip, is that families lost everything. And the story of the one woman who had some nice china, and someone came in, happened to be a white person come in, and she wanted to buy it for just like pennies. And rather than having to be humiliated and selling her precious china, she broke it all. And so you have tragic stories like that. So we were very, very fortunate. The Goods were very good. And when my parents were at the Pomona Relocation Center, they call it, or they were, my parents give them the sugar rations, and then she would make pastries or cakes or cookies for them while they were there. So they were wonderful.
I did, and it was a moment of happiness, right? Sometimes the amount of systematic racism at the hands of a white kind of majority, but I really did think that Mr. Good and his family provided such a historic example of what it means to be an ally, an advocate.
Exactly. Because one of the things Susie has helped me to understand their words for some of the experiences that I had growing up, and it's racist, it's hateful. So those didn't happen very often, but I had that history of this wonderful family. So it's opened my eyes to a lot and even helped me learn a lot more about my history and to appreciate what my parents endured and succeeded and survived.
Well, Susie, thank you for the historic pondering. Keiko, thank you for the historic example of maybe how we can all be a little good like Mr. Good.
Yes, you're good.
I think we'll now move into our final clip, which deals with the Southwest Museum and Miss Marva Felchlin.
Along Route 66, there are tons of communities that were once a part of this active highway. And a lot of the things that they built up represent American history, and the places that exist in the world around us tell our story.
We're here at the Casa De Adobe in Highland Park, Los Angeles. It was built by the Hispanic Society of California.
It's a replica of a 19th century Spanish rancho home, and it was built with the purpose of introducing the public to the early Spanish settlers.
This site is unique in that it was always an interpretive or educational site, never an active working ranch site. However, it was used for many different types of programs over the years, and especially during the peak popularity of Route 66.
For the first few years, it was a few blocks from Route 66, but that still benefited the visitation. And then in the early 1930s, the alignment was changed and the Casa sat right on Route 66.
Across the Southwest along Route 66, elite women were involved in pursuits that combined historic preservation with packaging of the Southwest to appeal to tourists.
This booklet is a Casa De Adobe handbook. In the inside cover, actually, we have a photograph of Señora Florencia Sepúlveda de Shonman. She's saying, "Buenas tardes, amigos." She was the Casa's first hostess, and she worked very hard to give visitors some kind of sense of early Spanish Californian life.
Right behind me is the Southwest Museum of the American Indian, which is perched up on a hillside.
The Southwest Museum, the campus is still there, and it was the first museum in Los Angeles. And the Casa De Adobe came under the auspices of the Southwest Museum in 1925.
Casa De Adobe was hand-built using traditional adobe brick. Brick by brick, tens of thousands of bricks are what make this structure.
And one of the curators there, Mark Raymond Harrington, became very interested in it. He was interested in the architecture of adobes, preserving California history, and he became a great supporter. And he worked very closely with Señora Florence Sepúlveda de Shonman. They established the Casa de Adobe committee to raise money to furnish the casa, to open it, and to care for it.
At the Southwest Museum up the hill, women also worked in anthropology and archaeology. Bertha Parker Palin Cody was the first female Native American archaeologist. She worked alongside her uncle and father at dig sites across the Southwest. However, her title was secretary. She exhibited her findings at the Southwest Museum and wrote for its publication Master Key, all the while participating in events at the Casa de Adobe.
In 1999, Congress passed the Route 66 Corridor Preservation Act to preserve the actual physical road, the built environment, and what you could say the cultural and intellectual history. Our greatest interest is in expanding the story of Route 66 to include diverse perspectives out of the mainstream narrative that has been published over and over for so long. And that would include, of course, Native Americans whose lands were traversed by building the road.
Route 66 traverses over 29 tribal lands, and its immediate predecessor in the area was the Atchison-Topeka Santa Fe Railroad. Instead of selling land rights to the railroad, the Pueblo traded land access for jobs for Pueblo members.
We are celebrating the Laguna Colony Days Festival in Winslow, Arizona. These are 2 days of celebrating the Laguna culture as well as the Laguna Colony that was affiliated with the Santa Fe Railroad. What happened was that the officials over at Santa Fe met with the governor of Laguna and said, "We need your land." A verbal agreement was struck, and it's called the Flower of Friendship. Santa Fe did have the notion to put 99 years in there. The important thing to remember is that indigenous culture has a different way of looking at time. And time, as far as 99 years, was considered to be forever, a lifetime, so to speak. The proclamation was that we wanted to acknowledge the Laguna community, our men and women that came here to start new lives, help the railroad, build the town of Winslow.
I'm so glad that all of you made it safely here.
Our committee is nothing but Indigenous females, and that's a first for us, and we're very pleased to be part of that.
All right, and now I'd like to invite back to the virtual, oh, perfect, here she is. So I'm gonna give a little bit of context and then ask the question, and correct me if I get it wrong, Marva. But so 1999, the preservation is a congressional act that is passed. And then in 2001, the National Park Service takes over the administration of that act. And that is the foundation for what is the Research Route 66, which is the library and archives of the 8 states in which you're a founding member for the state of California. And so I just wanted to ask you, with that in mind, you join a long history of elite women who contribute to the historic preservation and continued relevancy of Route 66. How do you think projects like Katrina, Candacy's, and stories like Larry, Keiko, and Susie help us to fill out the icon of Route 66?
Well, thank you, Brittany. A little bit more about Research Route 66. It's a collaborative effort of librarians and archives in each of the 8 states and representing institutions in each of the 8 states to identify and make accessible through databases and surveys within our states, primary resources to study Route 66. And I was the founding representative for the Autry on the group. And it really was one of the best experiences in my professional career. That said, the projects we're discussing today really do have an impact on the way we think about Route 66. I mean, we know that women's stories are crucial to telling a more diverse history of the road. And probably the greatest impact, in my opinion, of these projects that we're discussing is that they document experiences of people that were traditionally not included in the standard narrative of the road. And that provides an opportunity to understand the national significance of Route 66 more deeply and more broadly. So women, African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and other non-stream people have long been written out of the historical record. But when their stories are discovered and studied and shared, their voices do enter the historical record and become public knowledge. Evidence of women's interactions on and with Route 66 is not easily found, but without it, women's stories are not as vibrant and not fully told. So bringing to light the research resources that reveal these stories is another contribution made by these projects. Clearly, women lived and worked on and traveled along the road, but what did they see? How did they feel? Who did they meet? Gathering their firsthand experiences is key to documenting these stories. So materials such as photographs, diaries, home movies, business records, and letters, those are products of their lived experiences. They are the primary resources that tell the story and the pieces of the puzzle that are waiting to be fit together. Primary resources are often found in libraries, archives, museums, historical societies, and other kinds of institutions, and with families. And these materials may be unknown or little known, but once discovered and studied, projects and stories emerge. Also, by bringing to light these resources, the librarians and family members who care for these kinds of resources may be encouraged to look deeper into their collections to identify other resources. Women on the Mother Road and the oral histories from Monrovia, the Green Book, and Clifton Cafeteria stories that we've shared today also inform and inspire the work that Route 66 groups are doing to promote and preserve the road. These well-researched and well-documented stories give a sort of a wider lens for groups to examine the history of the built environment, of the physical road, the built environment, which is that, you know, environment around the road, and the experiences of people on the road. And here I'm referring to groups like Research Route 66, like the California Historic Route 66 Association, and other state Route 66 associations. And another group, the Route 66, The Road Ahead. So in addition, these projects support the work of the most invested stakeholders in the stakeholders that are most invested in the sustainability of the road. And this includes local, state, national, international, tourism-based, and tribal interests. So I think the impact of these projects and others like them that seek to tell a broader story of Route 66 is significant. And it gives me confidence that a more diverse story is in fact being written.
Yeah, and I just love kind of the working model of this research group, specifically with Research Route 66, but others that you mentioned, that it's kind of a collaboration between institutional resources, but then also independent and storytellers who want access to these primary resources that kind of have had stay power in an institutional setting. So I think it is a really good blend of kind of community-driven narrative and how major institutions can both be a resource, but also kind of a co-driver or an informer, but not the the perspective or voice of the information that's coming out of Route 66.
And in fact, Research Route 66 has a website that has all kinds of information, including institutions in each state along the route and in other parts of the state that hold Route 66 collections, highlights of collections of these various institutions, hints on getting started on archival research if you're new to it. You just put in Research Route 66 and it will come up.
Well, thanks so much for the context, Marva. I think now's a great time to hear from the filmmaker herself, the kind of the woman of the hour who got all of us together. So I'm gonna invite Katrina back on the virtual stage. Well, wow, just look at all these stories that have been brought to us today through your film project. I guess I just wanted to ask are there people that you wanted to interview that you didn't get to? Who would be next? What stories are still waiting to be told?
Well, there is one person I'd really like to interview, and I'm in terms of the film project itself, it is going to become a three-part series. It's a three-part series for public television that will be finished in 2021. So it grew from what was going to be a 1-hour film to a 3-hour film, but the stories that I've captured are just so intriguing and have taught me so much. I just didn't want to stop. Yeah. And so the one person who I guess top on my list of interviews, if I could interview someone, would actually be Joan Jett.
What?
There are these great pictures of her in the 1970s on Route 66 in Santa Monica Boulevard, and she lived at the Tropicana Motel at times. And I think that would just be a great perspective on the time, the 70s, and she's an iconic figure in rock and roll, and it would be something very different from what I've got so far. So
I always say diversity is in breadth of stories told, not in a single container. So I think that would definitely be a perspective that isn't represented right now.
Yeah.
Well,
there's one other thing I forgot to say in the opening, and I since I have the opportunity, there's a story on the Autry blog that we didn't feature today because of time, and it's about the Latina community in San Bernardino on Route 66 and these amazing entrepreneurs. And San Bernardino really, in terms of California and inspiration, they launched some of the cases that challenged segregation in California. And they came out of this very successful community on Route 66, and they challenged public recreational segregation first. They integrated cemeteries after World War II. They integrated schools, and these laid the way for larger federal cases that ended segregation. So I hope people will visit the Autry blog and watch that film.
I first want to invite everybody back on the stage, but I just wanted to shout out Katrina. That's the Milta Cafe, right? That family.
Yes, the Mitla Cafe, and then the Vias family, and Judith Vias became the first Latina mayor of a major U.S. city, and she's featured in that film. And her family was very involved in these movements to desegregate San Bernardino.
Amazing. Well, we need Keiko. Let me try to figure out.
Oh.
Remember it's perfect. Yay. Okay. Well, let me just run through some of the questions that are in the Q&A. How did it get called the Mother Road? Question.
It's of course, it goes back to the Grapes of Wrath. And it was John Steinbeck who coined the term. And he coined the term after looking, and it's a segment that I have in the film, after looking at the work of Dorothea Lange, and in particular, her image of migrant mother. And so he drew upon her work in his research, and that's how he came up with the term.
Other people are wondering some resources on the Green Book. So I think Candacy, they're talking about your work, and then Katrina, the Harvey Girls documentary. So maybe just at some point, if we want to drop in the chat, either a website or some media to get people that information. I guess right now I would love...
So just really quickly, you can just go to my website, tailormadeculture.com, and hit the Overground Railroad tab, and that'll lead you to the books and other ideas, but you can put in other materials as well. But thanks for asking.
And for me, you can look on Amazon. It's the Harvey Girls Opportunity Bound, and purchase the film that way. That would be great. Thank you.
I think right now, since I don't have any other kind of pressing questions, but we still have a couple minutes, maybe people are thinking about it because we've presented such great information. I just wonder, now that we've all joined the stage, is there anything someone wants to talk about amongst ourselves? Katrina, did you have any kind of connections that you hadn't been made yet? What am I forgetting?
Well, someone brought up the Autry Route 66 exhibit, which I thought was, great that they did that. Is it correct, Candacy, that was where you saw your first Green Book, or
yeah.
Can you talk about what you thought when you first saw it? And
yeah, I was writing a book on Route 66. I wrote a travel guide for Moon, and I'd been commissioned to do this project, and I was kicking myself soon after I signed the contract, because I realized I wasn't even going to get enough money to take the trip, like to do the research. So I was in this conundrum of wondering, like, how did I just kind of fall in? I was commissioned to write this book because I'd done my first book called Counterculture, which was on diner waitresses, and I'd interviewed diner waitresses on Route 66 and other throughout the United States. So I stumbled into this by accident, and then I was at the Autry Museum because they had a big show on Route 66, and tucked away in a corner was under glass was a green book, a copy of a green book, and I'd never seen a green book. I never knew such a thing existed, and I remember running out of the museum, and I actually took a photograph, and it said don't take a photograph, so but I did it anyway, and ran outside, and I called my parents, and I was like, do you know about this? Like, did you use this? Like, what is this? And my stepfather, who had grown up in the Jim Crow South, dark-skinned Black man, and I tell his stories throughout my book, Overground Railroad. He knew what it was, but my mom had never heard of it and didn't know what it was. And from that experience, it was like almost the skies opened up, and I thought, oh, this is the project. Like, this is why I'm like doing this travel guide on Route 66, because I was supposed to learn about the Green Book. And then that set off, you know, many years of research and work, and I still have many years to go doing other Green Book related projects. So yeah, thank you to the Autry. My God, none of this would have happened, I don't think, if I'd been there on that day. So eternally grateful.
Well, and what's a little bit even bigger of a conundrum is I went to research the collection ID on our website, and I reached out to Marva because it wasn't ours. We borrowed it. Marva, right? Do you want to unmute? Or?
Yes, it was borrowed. Candacy, do you remember from where? I mean,
where you guys borrowed it from? Or
have the where we borrowed it from. It's not part of our collection. And
no, I don't know. I think because we were looking for some, because for the exhibition I'm working on with the Smithsonian, is called Negro Motorist Green Book, and we had a really hard time finding one, and I think we contacted the Autry to see where you had originally got it, and I don't know if we ever got an answer, but they're very rare. It's very difficult, especially now that they're even more popular. The last one sold at auction for nearly $30,000.
I remember being surprised as to where the curator found it. I know that I'm pretty sure New York Public Library has some, but I was saying to Brittany that for some reason in my mind is UC Santa Barbara Special Collections, but I tried to look on their catalog and didn't find it, so that might just be something I made up. Because Brittany and I went there.
That Marva thinks
yes, I know you can easily, there are facsimiles published, but finding the original books, I mean, they're made to be used, they're ephemeral, really, made to be used and then thrown away because next year a new one came out.
Yeah, and the importance of that being up-to-date information was life or death. It was more critical for sure. But you know, you can, that's why I had the fellowship at the Schomburg, because they do have the largest collection of green books. They have, gosh, almost nearly the entire collection. I think they're missing one or two editions from 1937 to 1967. No one, to our knowledge, has ever seen a 1936 edition. So it's, you know, it's a rare and beautiful thing. And you can actually, if you Google NYPL Green Book, you can, they've digitized their entire collections. You can flip through them, and you can buy facsimiles on Amazon as well. So, you know, it's an amazing piece of history, but they're still, they used to pop up on eBay when I first started doing this research, and they'd be a few $1,000s, but I have not, now that the film and you know, it's become more popular, they're even more difficult to pin down.
So I have a couple questions in the chat now. One is for Keiko and one is for Larry. So we'll go maybe Keiko first. Keiko, they're asking about how your family got restarted after being released from the concentration camps. I don't know if you feel comfortable speaking to this, but it was in the box. I'm reading it out loud. You can feel free to pass.
So they were very fortunate since they had the property to come back to. I don't know if he continued farming. There are pictures of me following him as he's tilling the soil. My parents, when they came back, they had gotten married at Heart Mountain. And so there was domestic work for my mother and my aunt, and my father became a gardener. And so those are the type of opportunities for them. For a while, they were actually like the help. My mother and father were one of the stars back then. I don't recall his name right now, but they basically did the housework and the gardening and took care of the little boy. And then my aunt, I don't know how she found the job after she got out. She became a seamstress for Lucille Ball.
Oh.
So that was interesting, but it's the domestic type things that they were involved in, because it would be difficult to have Japanese working in other industries.
And Larry, the question for you was if you have memories of driving through sundown towns, what was your experience?
I just remembered the name, the sundown towns, but as a kid, I can't remember or be able to pinpoint the exact, towns. Yeah, that's 50 years ago.
But that's more kind of a category of
yes.
a noun as opposed to a proper noun.
I have a quick question, Larry. Do you remember seeing signs as a kid, or as you were going through the towns? Do you remember because a lot of those, any ephemera and proof of these sundown towns has vanished. It's very hard to find the original signs, or do you remember seeing any of them?
No, I don't.
No. Okay.
No, I didn't. I don't remember seeing any. The only thing that I can remember is just the signs on the doors of the bathrooms, blacks only, like that. I remember those, but not actually, going into a town and seeing the sign of a town or anything like that. No. Just knowing that you can't eat in certain cafes, things like that. I remember those.
There's another question in the chat, and this one's for Katrina. So someone had asked what your takeaway from the Laguna Colony Days event was. Unmute.
It was very inspiring to me. I love being, seeing communities embrace their history, and to look at it, from a new vantage point, I think is really important. And then the other thing is, I think it's very important when you're telling historical stories to have a tie to the present, to show that, I think especially with indigenous cultures, they've tended to be represented like they're kind of in the past tense almost. And of course, that's entirely untrue. And so I seek out stories that show like the vibrancy of the present culture.
I think this might be our final question so that we can wrap up by 12:30. I just wanted to take a moment to thank everybody who's joined us on this virtual stage and who's joined us as an attendee. And I think it's phrased for Councilman Spicer, but I wonder if Susie or Keiko would have anything to add, as it is about Monrovia. Do you know of any of the safe places in Monrovia where people of color who were traveling through could stop for a meal or an overnight stay? dealer's
Monrovia was not in the green book I checked. But because Monrovia, Doherty, and Pasadena were not sundown towns, people had families here. People had safe places or relatives or friends that they could stay with. So I don't think Monrovia would be on the green book. There were a couple places in Pasadena, which is the next town over. But again, this was the only 3 sort of non-sundown towns in Los Angeles County.
Susie, we had a conversation real briefly about my mother's experience about wondering if Japanese would be served at restaurants. I don't recall going to any restaurants in Monrovia. We always went down to Little Tokyo. I don't know if Larry had that experience, being able to.
No, not in Monrovia. I ate pretty good in Monrovia. You know, I didn't have Monrovia was good. You know, it was just Monrovia was good. Monrovia has been good to our family. You know.
I want to add that, you know, and Katrina's work is so important because both Larry and Keiko are a little bit younger. And this was when the situation was starting to change. It was Larry's dad, Keiko's grandfather, that suffered more discrimination and racism. But because of their endurance, Larry and Keiko, and definitely me, had it much, much easier by the 1950s.
Right.
Well, I always like to end on a positive note, and that one was really positive. So Katrina, if you wanted to say anything in closing, or if anyone on the stage wanted to say anything, we have about 3 minutes, so we can.
Can I say something to Katrina?
Yeah.
Katrina, thank you very much. You know, I really do appreciate you coming back, and also with Susie, you know, setting up this little memory bank that I had in my head as a kid, and you brought it back out of me as an adult. I really do appreciate this. And Candace, I've learned a lot from you. I've really learned a lot, you know, so it's going to make me go back and do some more reading. So I really do appreciate that. Keiko, I love you. Keep up the work. All right. Marva, I really enjoyed everything, okay? Brittany, you've been pretty good.
Excellent.
Okay,
I think so.
You're welcome to Monrovia anytime.
Thank you, Councilman.
All right.
I just want to echo what Larry was saying, and to Katrina, like, you know, I've known you for years now, but I'm honored to be a part of this. I think your work is really important, and it's so well done, and your heart is so big, and your skills are just as powerful. And I just want to, I just think your work should be celebrated. So, like I said, I'm glad I'm here, but I think, you know, and it's nice to meet everyone virtually, and I enjoyed all the stories, and I'm learning a lot from all of you guys too, so thank you.
Thank you all. This has been wonderful, and for all the sweet words.
Thank you, Katrina.
Everyone else.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you very much.